Welcome to the School of Rock Bottom podcast with Oliver Mason. I'm an actor, a performing arts principal, a voiceover artist, and a mental health coach. It's these careers and passions combining that have given birth to this podcast. Those working in entertainment are twice as likely to suffer from depression and up to 15 times more likely to have an anxiety disorder. And those working across the creative industries are 3 times more likely to have a mental health problem. So on this podcast, I invite amazing creatives who have suffered a rock bottom but have survived. These stories need to be told so that people know that there is always hope and there is always a way out. Before I start today's podcast, I would like to add an extra trigger warning that we are going to be discussing subjects around child sexual abuse. I'm really honoured and excited today because I've got the brilliant Andy Jeffery with me. How you doing, Andrew?
I'm good. Thank you, Oliver.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to give Andy a bit of an intro. And in the absence of an auto cue, those watching on YouTube, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please do that. Forgive me while I look down at the show notes, because I wouldn't want to get anything wrong here with my esteemed guest.
I'll fill in the gaps.
Yeah, that's a good one. Okay, so Andy was heavily involved in drama as a youngster and has over 20 years in theatre management and organising numerous national music hall and variety festivals. These days, Andy is a public speaker, writer and campaigner, whose autobiographical book, A Small Boy Smiling, tells a remarkable story of survival and how he has overcome the trauma, guilt and shame of childhood sexual abuse, teenage alcoholism and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. When he was 8 years old, he was targeted by a group of predatory paedophiles who subjected him to 18 months of horrific sexual abuse. A Small Boy Smiling was published under the pseudonym Matt Carey. Since the book was published in 2018, Andy has been busy with public talks for the NSPCC and other national charities. He was the subject on BBC Radio 4's The Untold, which attracted over 1.1 million listeners, and has spoken openly about his experiences on BBC Radio 2's Jeremy Vine Show and BBC 5 Live's Stephen Nolan Show. Andy is a regular keynote speaker in the UK and internationally. In 2019, he was honoured to be pledged speaker at the major fundraiser for the UK charity Childline. And Andy is now also looking for new opportunities as an actor. So he's gone full circle, which is brilliant. As I mentioned in the trigger warning, we are going to be talking about some very serious themes and some stats that I discovered in the last week leading up to this podcast have really surprised me and upset me, if I'm honest with you, that there are 2 million adult survivors of sexual abuse in the UK, that 1 in 4 women have been assaulted or raped, and 1 in 5 children have suffered sexual abuse. And I had no idea it was that high. Before we talk about that in a lot more detail, Andy, I'd like to ask you if you could take us back to a rock bottom moment in your life. I know that there's more than one. So if you want to discuss a couple, that's fine. And really try to describe to the listeners and the viewers exactly what was going on in the best way that you can.
Thanks, Oliver. It's a great pleasure to be here. And it is weird to use the word pleasure, but you know, I kind of find these as an opportunity. There's been a lot of healing over the years. And that's come about by getting support and talking about what happened and learning how to release a lot of it. And by being around people who have been through similar things and are that bit further along the healing journey than I am, or certainly I was anyway. And you're right. Thank you for mentioning the trigger warning. I'm not going to be gratuitous, just to let any survivors, and I'm sure there will be survivors listening to this because there are so many of us, you know, the stats kind of say it all. And so I'm not going to be gratuitous about what happened. There's no need to be. We know what abuse is. We know what sexual abuse is. In terms of rock bottoms, I suppose specifically to the abuse, the worst moment was, as you mentioned about alcoholism, I was a teenage alcoholic. I hit rock bottom with alcohol at the age of 20. And at that stage, the booze had stopped working completely. So nothing got rid of the flashbacks to the abuse that I was experiencing. And that was horrific because effectively you're reliving the abuse. You're losing contact almost entirely with the reality of where you are, and you're back in the child, if you like, in terms of how the body's reacting and what's coming into the mind, and you're feeling the fear and the shame and the panic and the menace and everything else. And at my very worst, I had such an awful sense of shame that I felt, and this is graphic, but I felt almost as if I had fungus growing underneath my skin. I felt such a sense of disgust with myself, because I blamed myself. The med had convinced me that it was all my fault. And the consequence of the alcoholism was that I developed such a self-hatred and such a level of psychosis that I wasn't really present to my surroundings. I was living with that trauma on a daily basis. And that was when I had a lot of suicidal thoughts. And I mean, I already was self-harming. I was already punching myself in the face quite a bit. I was headbutting walls, and I was doing whatever I could to literally knock myself out, because the reality of these memories, these flashbacks, was just so horrific that I was desperate for them to stop. And at the age of 20, that was my first significant rock bottom. And that was probably the worst bit. It's strange, there is a stage beyond that a little bit more, which was in recovery from alcoholism. I was at this point sober, and I was about 8 months off alcohol, and I was still having flashbacks. I had them for many years. And I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm very grateful to be sober through AA. And I used to love playing cricket as a kid. That changed with the cricket bat, but I used to get a cricket bat, and it was in a frenzy to do anything to stop reliving the abuse. So I would get a bat and absolutely F and blind. And just at myself in the mirror, I wanted to see myself hurting, because I felt I was the wrong. I was the one wholly responsible for everything that happened. I've since learned that many, many other survivors of sexual abuse, child sexual abuse, adult sexual abuse, have that same false belief that they are responsible in some way. And clearly they are not, and I wasn't either. But it took years I knew that intellectually as a young adult. How could I be responsible? I was 8, 9, 10 when all this happened. But because of the nature of post-traumatic stress disorder and the difficulty talking about it, because you go into a place of shock, that's what the flashbacks are about. It's a shocking event which you're finding very hard to verbalize, because the memories at times are very fragmented. Other times they're very lucid, very vivid, very real, and you're still in a place of shock in a slightly different way. But so many of these false beliefs are trapped within the suppressed memories of the abuse, which in my case came up much later in life, which precipitated writing the book. I was in trauma therapy again at that stage, which was about 7 years ago. And so this has been a long journey, and it's needed to be. And I don't regret that. I needed the time to heal. And anyone who's been through child sexual abuse or any form of sexual abuse will know that it takes time, but healing really is possible. I couldn't be here talking about it. I mean, that's just a statement of fact. I couldn't talk about this in a public arena if I didn't feel much more at peace with my experiences.
And the stats around men sharing this kind of thing, you really are a hero, because the stats show that many men don't feel that they can talk about it. And the fact that you're on here doing just that, to me, you're a hero, and I highly, highly commend you for doing so. It's going to help millions of people.
Thank you.
Doing.
Well, thank you for saying that. It's true that very few men talk about this. I think where I've been incredibly fortunate is that I've met a number of men, as I mentioned, I think at the top, or a number of people, men and women. But I suppose the men helped me more in a way, because I could directly relate to those experiences. Who have been that bit further along the healing journey than me. And I could relate to them, because one of the things about child sexual abuse or any form of trauma is that you feel incredibly isolated. you really feel responsible. You can't possibly tell anyone about it. You've been forced into a silence by the mind games and the threats and the menace. I mean, these men, they threatened to kill me. There were a pair of scissors involved at one point. There were regular threats to my life. And then there were mind games. I mean, the threats that there were other men around who treated children really badly in this area, but we're going to look after you and you just do what we want and you'll be absolutely fine. But if you don't, and there's always that but, and they kept ramping up the pressure again and again. And in the end, you just shut down because you just cannot cope with it emotionally, mentally. I mean, adults wouldn't be able to cope with that, let alone a child, And then you shut down completely, and I remember normalizing the abuse. It was as if that part of my body was like nothing to do with me, and I would drift away in my own world and live in a fantasy world, which continued into my adult life as a coping mechanism. Some kind of external fantasy, be it alcohol or work or a woman or just a fantasy world, because reality was too painful. I kept running away from that. And so much of that stems back to the abuse and those learned coping mechanisms. Right.
And in terms of the first question I asked you, having read your book, I was surprised that you took us to that point when you were 20. I thought you were going to perhaps take us back to the moment when you were 8, that you talk about in the book. And I don't expect you to go through that potentially now, but for those that are listening who maybe want a little bit more information about what happened, I wondered if you could just summarize that.
Sure.
That moment. I know it's a difficult moment to talk about.
I'm happy to do that. The challenge with PTSD, as I would imagine most people with PTSD, I was given an upgrade a few years ago, complex PTSD now. You've got to have a bit of dark humor. Well, it helps to, have a little bit, if you like. The challenge was that most of the memories of the abuse I had, which I could remember, they were there very early in my recovery, and I had a lot of professional help for a couple of years, solid trauma therapy in my early 20s. The most horrific memories of the abuse and the grooming that happened came back to me 8 years ago. And the challenge is the memories for me did not come back in chronological order. If they had done, and it's just the way it is, if I had remembered the nature of the grooming in my early 20s, I would have realized this false belief was false, i.e. that I was responsible, because the grooming was so immediate and menacing. And, I was playing football in a park around the corner from where I used to live in Weston-super-Mare. And I do remember the fact that there'd been men watching, us play football on and off for a little while. But there was loads of people walking dogs in the park, lots of things happening in the park. So that didn't seem out of the ordinary. But one occasion, I'm desperate to go to the loo, and there was about 3 or 4 public toilets in the park, and I went to one, and I'm in the latrine, and suddenly there are 2 men, one either side of me, and there's one. Later, I realised was kind of a look at the door, and they started talking to me about what a great footballer I was and how they came and admired me. And one of them said, "Yeah, I finished work early because I can see you're a professional footballer in the making." All this kind of so-called charm offensive happening. But I knew this was weird. I felt very uncomfortable. I mean, you're one guy who's 6'2", and I'm 4'8" or whatever I was at 8. And another guy right next to me, and you can sense, and I remember feeling the menace and the threat and the closeness of them physically. And then one of the smaller ones whips out, his whatever, and starts to talk about it and says, "It's all right, you can look," and all this kind of stuff. And I don't want to look. I want to pee, and I want to go and play football. And then another guy starts to say that, he puts pressure on me by saying, "We could see you've been waving at us, and we wanted to come in and say hello, and we know you're one of our special friends," and all of this stuff is going on. And I remember saying, "Like, listen, I want to go. I don't remember waving. I'm really sorry, but I want to go." And they start to have a go at me about this notion that I've been teasing them in some way, that I've been leading them on. And the atmosphere changes very, very quickly into the menace of it all. And then the bigger chap next to me on my left starts to say he's feeling very ill and he's got an enormous pain, and the pain's in the groin. And the other guy puts me under pressure to rub him off. And eventually I do that. I don't want to do it. I know it feels wrong to do that. I feel very scared, but I want to get out. And so I do rub him off. And obviously he's relieved. And then it kind of developed from there, you know. And I mean, I'm condensing what happened over probably 10 minutes thereabouts. You know, I mean, they'd already made out they knew where I went to school, and they knew the head teacher well, because they said, "Oh, what's that teacher at that school you go to?" And I said the name of the school, and they said, "Oh, yes, we know the head teacher there. You know, yes, what's his name, Martin?" And I said, "No, his name is," you know. He said, "Yes, we know him. Yes, of course you meet him social, whatever, golf or something." And so they just shut down every avenue there could be. So they normalised the whole experience, and they made out they knew exactly where I lived, which eventually they did, because they used to follow me home. You know, and you know, 18 months, 2 years of sexual abuse, twice a week, sometimes 3 times a week, started from there, in multiple locations with loads and loads of different men. And in the end, you just get on with it, because you don't know a way out. And that was the hardest thing, because those memories of the grooming, of everything I've just explained, came back to me like 8 years ago, 7 years ago. The worst memory of the abuse, which was the final memory, which was the scissors, and they were threatening to use them, that came back to me 7 years ago.
Right.
And so that kind of bookended it. And in many ways, remembering that, talking about it, releasing so much rage that I had, and shame that I had, and confusion, brought about the healing. I mean, I had a breakdown which led to the breakthrough. You know, I'd been sober probably 20 years by then. And it wasn't about drinking. I didn't want to drink, but I was suicidal again. And, you know, shortly before the breakdown, I was running a theatre in another part of the country. And the Savile stuff was happening on TV. I'm sure you remember all these.
Of course, yeah.
These stories came out about Savile and, you know, what he did, the evil man that he was. And I remember watching that very obsessively, like on Channel 4 News, wanting to dive into the television and torture him, if I'm honest. The rage I felt, the embodiment of all that rage towards all of those different men who had raped and abused me, I wanted to take out on him.
Yeah.
And the truth is, Oliver, I mean, we've been good friends, theatre friends now for some years, is that, I mean, you know me, and I'm not a violent man at all, and
not at all.
Thank God for that. But it's like the most horrific attachment to one's personality is the trauma, because the fight inside of you is, I think I always knew I was a gentle soul, but the desire to hurt certain men, you know, who reminded me of the abusers, were overwhelming. Yeah, I'm so relieved that I never ever acted out on that violence, because it's kind of all or nothing, do you know? Yeah. I mean, just as a very quick aside, if I may,
of course,
there was a serial killer called Michael Ryan, and Hungerford, 1987, and he killed 16 people. I have no idea why. He might have been psychosis. He might have whatever. I don't know why he did it. And but whenever I was triggered, after I was triggered, and the flashbacks would happen, and they'd be like Groundhog Day. This is my 20s into my 30s. And it wasn't every week, but it was often. And when they happened, it would completely floor me. I just feel exhausted, and I felt like barricaded myself into the flat almost. You know, I didn't, but I felt as if, you know. And the fragmented flashbacks would happen to the incident with the scissors, the final incident of the abuse, and this was the most horrific one. And I didn't have enough visual memory of those flashbacks at that stage to be able to talk about it. All I knew was that in my mind, I was at the edge of this abyss, and it was horrible. It was horrific. And my body would be so anxious. So, you know, my neck, huge pains in the neck, you know, palpitations down the side. You know, I would just be exhausted, the base of my spine, bit of pain, a lot of pain. And in my genitalia area, there was like shame was there, if you know, and it was embodiment of it. It was just horrific. And when I would come through that, being exhausted, I would think about Michael Ryan. And I think in some ways my conscious mind was trying to understand the level of rage that I felt within me towards these men. And it was as if all the people Ryan had killed were the men that I was raging against, who I couldn't name. I didn't know who they were. They weren't linked to school or to a club or a football team or anything like that. These were strangers, well-organised paedophiles in a small seaside town.
Yeah.
So that I'm just so grateful I never acted out on that rage. My life would be, I would be in prison. I would be a lifer. I'm not exaggerating.
Absolutely.
I'm really not exaggerating.
I'm very glad you're not in prison, Andy. I'll tell you
Same
that.
here.
You've covered an awful lot there, and thank you for that. And what I'm going to attempt to do now is kind of break it up into pieces, if you like. Just going back to your book, from what I gather, my understanding of it was, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that after the abuse stopped, it's almost like you kind of blocked it out, but it wasn't until your teenage years and puberty when you were getting sexually attracted, as we all do, to others. I believe it was the guilt and the shame around feeling sexual attraction to females that actually brought back the memories from when you were 8. Is that where alcohol came in then, for you to then sort of block out that guilt and shame and the PTSD that came with it? Were you self-medicating with alcohol?
Almost, yes. I mean, my first drink, very briefly, I was 8, Leafamish, white wine, and the buzz, the effect was immediate. And that physiological reaction in my body was just, I loved it. I loathed the taste, but I loved the effect. So that was when I was 8. And you're right, when I hit puberty at the age of 12, I remember being on a holiday in Churman Hall, which is in Cornwall. And there's a lovely she was my age, presumably 12, blonde girl there. And I really, really, really fancied her. It's the first crush I ever had.
Yeah.
It was a horrific experience. I hated the way I felt. As you rightly said, I felt dirty. I felt disgusted with myself. I felt panicky. And I learned later on in life that, sexual attraction for me was a massive trigger to the abuse. So what should have been a very enjoyable, maybe confusing experience at the age of 12, of course.
But nowhere near to that level.
It was just horrific. And I didn't self-medicate straight away, but my attitude to alcohol was, and whenever I had the opportunity to drink, I drank and I adored it. But my family are not alcoholics at all. They just normal drinkers. But I remember being at my parents' 25th wedding anniversary, and it was in a local church hall, and I nominated myself to look after the bar. No one asked me to do that. I did that, and I was
taking a lot of booze in the church.
Hey, mate, there was at that, but and I nominated myself, and I remember taking out the empties, and they weren't empty. There was booze in them, and at the age of 15, I was drinking more regularly whenever I could. So I was going to a school in Bristol. I was doing plays, so I was doing rehearsals, and I was hanging out a little bit later after rehearsal than going home and having the odd drink here and there. And I loved it. It made me feel big. It made me feel powerful. I got a buzz out of it. And by the age of 17, I was blacking out, and I was already stealing for alcohol then. And 17 to 20, I was drinking alcoholically. And I mean, not every day, but whenever I had the opportunity to drink, which was often, because I used to create the opportunities. I drank, and I drank to get drunk. I drank for that buzz, for that. And it blocked out these awful, horrific feelings, because throughout my teens, I fancied plenty of different girls, but I was just like crippled by the emotions that I was feeling. And I didn't understand them. And people who haven't been abused might not understand this. Forgive me, maybe they do, but I didn't understand it anyway. But I buried that as much as I could. I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to go there. And whilst the booze worked for me and I got the buzz, that rocket fuel, it was wonderful. And in the end, I would do anything to get a hold of a drink. But come the age of 17, 18, the buzz had gone. There was never a kick out of it. There was never that rocket fuel. And I was desperate to get it, and I drank and I used drugs, and, I did whatever I could to get drunk. And I couldn't even get to oblivion in the end. Nothing knocked out the insanity. And that's when I started the self-harm. And right at the end of my drinking, I think it was about 19, there used to be Old Spice aftershave in white bottles. It used to have like a gold rim. Right. And I remember the morning after night before with the shakes, trying to bite this rim off, trying to bite the rim off to drink the aftershave. Wow. And I drank some of it, and it went down. It was disgusting. It burnt, and it was horrible. And as I drank the aftershave, I was punching myself in the face as well. Just fuck. And I used to it's just, it's just... That was the level of self-hatred. Now, I was brought up in a very loving family. I come from a loving family, you know, and still a very loving family. I was with them over the weekend. It was a nice time. So none of this trauma, none of the abuse was anything to do with them at all.
Yeah.
But one of the greatest effects of the abuse was the belief I had for so long that I was a disgusting piece of shit and I deserved to be in pain. And I've met so many survivors who have felt the same way.
Right.
And it's a challenge to unpick that, because with PTSD, getting access to those memories to talk about that stuff is very difficult.
Yeah.
You know, but there are incredible ways people do EMDR and various other therapies.
Well, this is what I was going to ask you, actually, and these are some of the elements that I'm keen to break down a little bit. If we could touch on the alcohol abuse first, if that's all right, because
Sure.
You referenced that you've not had a drink in a long time. Actually, that's not fully true, because I know that actually it's 30 years, so it's a very long time tomorrow since your last drink. And I know in the book you attribute your sobriety to Alcoholics Anonymous and AA, and I would assume that anyone listening to this who is struggling around alcohol, that you would suggest that they try an AA meeting. I would guess. In terms of the PTSD, just for someone that doesn't understand PTSD. Imagine we've got a 10-year-old here that's, you know, learning about PTSD. In kind of most simple terms you can, could you try and break it down? Because I still, you know, I do understand PTSD. I've had to for work, but I still think it's something that people struggle with. And I'm just interested from your experience. If you could try and simplify it as best we can what it is.
Before I was able to talk about the abuse, my experience of the abuse would be that I would be triggered by sexual attraction, or by a man who reminded me of one of the abusers in some subconscious way. And that could be on a bus, it could be on a train, it could be something completely innocuous. And what would happen is very quickly, rather like a switch being pulled or being pushed, I would start to relive the emotions of it. So I would go from someone being fairly calmish to suddenly feeling very much under threat, very scanning the area, and I would feel the tension in the body. I would feel a sense of panic. I would feel a sense of sometimes numbness. You know, sometimes it'd be one extreme or the other, either complete numbness and in shock of trying to work out what's going on, like a rabbit in the headlights sort of thing, or being in a car accident. You know, if you've just been in a car accident and someone says to you, recite the poem you told me yesterday, you can't do it. You're in shock. Well, PTSD is that kind of experience. And often with PTSD, and particularly complex PTSD, you have flashbacks. And this is when the trauma from the abuse comes, and I used to call it my savage mind. It's like the trauma is just attacking you, and you're having flashbacks of images of people doing things to you, and as I said, the scissors and so forth would just be there, and I'd just be like that, you know. And and
this could be happening regardless of what you're doing. You could be watching a film. You could.
Well, it happens out of the blue. This is the challenge of complex or PTSD. I mean, I remember once sitting with my first AA sponsor, actually, in a cafe. And I can't remember what he said, but he said something and it triggered a response from me, and I just felt really uncomfortable. And this was one of the worst experiences of what we call disassociation, where you start to lose consciousness with what's going on. Right. You're going to another place, and it was tunnel vision for a while. I mean, you're 3 foot away from me, and I remember my sponsor being there, and I was like 6 foot away, and almost like a tunnel.
Is it like a disassociation? Is it?
Yeah,
is it similar? Because you get that in a panic attack, don't you? Where you get disassociation.
Yeah, and I feel like my consciousness was going, like my legs might give way at my worst. And I remember times just hiding in a park and just being just feeling so humiliated and out of control. But if someone said to me, "What happened? What's wrong with you?" I wouldn't have been able to verbalize it. Right. Dealing with people or situations. And that was the greatest challenge with PTSD, is that sudden switch that happens in the mind. Now, in later life, the healing from that, you actually can. My experience is you can heal from that. Yeah. I can still dissociate a little bit. I can still feel a bit panicky, but I don't relive the abuse as the 8-year-old, 9-year-old, 10-year-old who went through it. Now my memory of the abuse is more distant in the healthiest sense, that it's like any other memory on the screen of my mind. It's still a horrible thing to think about, but I'm not in it. I'm watching the screen. With PTSD at its worst, you're effectively in the screen. It's happening around you. So the person who's talking to you, who's your friend, who might have innocently said something which has triggered you, in one level of your mind has now become the threat. And so you're kind of like, and they're not a threat, but there's a part of you which is so traumatized that you just don't know what the hell's going on. And that shock element of PTSD is the most important thing to recognize at the beginning, because there are various grounding techniques this wonderful psychotherapist I had in my early 20s taught me. I used to go there for nearly 2 years, and he helped me just reconnect. He used to say, you're living in this mental universe. I'm going to bring you gently back into the physical universe.
Right.
So instead of being just here, just trapped in everything, by touching things like a tree or, I used to go into the bathroom. He would never come in. He knew that was a trigger. The bathroom door would always be open, and I would wash the water, gentle, either lukewarm water or cold water, and it's very tactile things, just running water over your hands, and then just gently over your face. It's a gradual process of grounding which can help lessen the effects of the flashbacks.
So anyone listening to this who's suffering with PTSD or might have a family member or a friend that is there any particular type of therapy that's worked for you to deal with that? Because I think you've tried quite a few different approaches.
Oh yeah.
Would I be right? I mean, one of them I think
the block a little bit.
Well, that's all right. I think equine therapy is one that you've tried, for example. I mean, I don't want to open up to, too many forms to confuse the listeners, but is there any sort of go-to ones that have been particularly useful for you?
Well, I was very cynical about equine therapy at the beginning. I was very cynical about a lot of things, to be honest with you. Contempt, pride, or investigation, and fear of being taken for a mug, fear of people, all those things I had in my 20s, which got better in my late 20s, early 30s, and theatre actually played a massive role in developing more confidence. But in my early 40s, I needed a lot more help, and I went to an amazing trauma therapist, Sarah the Grove Practice, Wimpole Street, who I do workshops with now. Got a great working relationship with her. But Sarah, amongst many other specialties, is an equine therapist. Okay. And I've always been terrified of horses. And the simple reason is that they are physically so big. And that's a trigger. Yeah. Because as an 8-year-old child, you've got a 6'2" man or whatever, that physicality. So being near horses, who for me are dominant, kind of silent and all the rest of it, was a real... And doing the therapy with Sarah over the course of a morning session, and these two massive mares were wandering around, and they're her horses, so they were very happy and very chilled out with Sarah being there with me. I wasn't happy about it at all at the beginning. But gradually, over a period of time, I started to physically touch the horses. And my fear always was that they were just going to kick me at the back, just kick me, kind of, fuck off. And of course, that was this fear of rejection. That was this fear of being humiliated in some way or being out of my depth or whatever. But what happened is, as I got closer to the horses and kind of touched them and patted them, and they were chilled out about the whole thing, they were looking back and acknowledging me, and Sarah's there interpreting what's happening for me. What happened was a deep, visceral kind of emotion started to come up. And in that experience, I was closer to the memories of the abuse than I ever had been before because of the physicality. It was a strange, weird experience, and it was exhausting to the extent that I remember getting a coach home from, I think we were near Chippenham, and so I got a coach to Victoria Coach Station, and I was so exhausted, so drained. I thought, how the fuck am I going to get home from here? I'm only like half an hour on the tube from Victoria. And, and I got home and I slept for probably a couple of days because something deep within me started to shift. And with that came an immense amount of crying. Now, Oliver, I hadn't been able to cry for years and years and years and years and years about this. Okay. This was the greatest challenge. I would feel the emotion come to here, and I was so terrified of that emotion. I was terrified of my rage, and I was terrified of being vulnerable. So whenever the emotion comes to here, I worked doubly hard at work. I became the workaholic again, or I obsessed about this, or I ate about that. Or
so you're avoiding it with other
avoiding
things.
it. Okay. I was so scared of the enormity of how I felt. And it was the equine therapy which finally helped me to release the tears. And by God, when they came, it was extraordinary. I mean, the floodgates were huge. And I'm so grateful that it came, because that really, I could feel a shift happening energetically. I could feel an emotional change taking place. That was before the book was written. The book was being written. Although I didn't plan to write a book at the beginning, I was writing notes about the abuse and the memories and the locations and how many men I could remember. And, 13 different locations, 50 plus men probably. Right. And all of those facts, when you see them there and all these other memories are coming up, are just so shocking, but in a weird way, validating in the sense that, well, no wonder you need to talk about this. Yeah. No wonder you need help. But then saying to yourself, just rewarding yourself in the nicest way with that internal dialogue. I used to have photographs of me I still have photographs of me as a kid, but I didn't like looking at them when I was younger. I used to want to spit at them. I really hated that child in me. Right. And part of the therapy was to find a few photographs of me around the age of the abuse and talk to that child. And I started to do that. And
a lot of those pictures are in your book, aren't they?
Yeah, a lot of the pictures
which
in the book.
Shows the healing that's gone on.
Yeah, the cover of the book, yeah.
Andy, I just want to interject, if you don't mind, quickly. Sure. And I don't want to come across, too lovey-lovey here when I say this, but out of all the people that I know personally who kind of embody just love and, just being in a great, great place, maybe people that are the closest to God, if there is such a thing, I would definitely have to put my wife in that list.
Yes.
Otherwise I'll be in trouble.
Yeah, you will be.
I do genuinely mean that. But I would also put you there as well as being one of the most closest people to God, if there is such a thing or a term, as you. And that phrase, anything is possible, that any healing is possible, refers to you more than anybody that I can think of, certainly personally, but maybe ever. Because despite of that awful start that you had in life, you are this wonderful person that gives back and does so much. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. And I just find it so incredibly inspiring that you are the man that you are, despite what's happened, because I know how much you help people and how much work you do. I just wondered, and we're going to go on to some other sort of modes of healing in a moment. This potentially is quite a difficult question. What role has forgiveness played in all of this? Because when I hear your story, you talked about it earlier that, you're glad you're not in prison. I can't imagine being in a place where you are now. I imagine that I probably would have gone out and killed these men as well. And all the great teachers, whether it's Buddha or Nelson Mandela, I think Nelson Mandela said, didn't he, when he came out of prison, that if I don't forgive the people that put me in prison, I'll still be in prison. I just wondered, for those people that are harboring great resentments in their life from trauma and abuse in the past, who are stuck, how did you get to this place of, I'm assuming, forgiveness? On some level.
I would say that. Yeah, I think. Thank you. I mean, it's a good question, very good question. I think there are two words I really misunderstood for a long time. One was acceptance, and the other one was forgiveness. And my idea of acceptance for a long time was, you just accept it, then you get on with it and whatever, which is rubbish. Acceptance to me now means what happened in its entirety. I'm not going to run away from it anymore. I'm not going to minimize it. I won't put my head in the sand about it. It's seeing it for what it is. And I had to see the abuse for what it is in its entirety. And then learn that it was nothing to do with me. It wasn't my fault. All of the shit, all of the shame, all of the everything around it belongs entirely to the men who abused me. It's their crap. and it's nothing to do with me. Took me years to know that. And that links with forgiveness. I thought forgiveness meant, yeah, I forgive you, as if suddenly it's okay. And, forgiveness for me is about, for me to heal. It's got fuck all to do with them.
Right.
The difference is I'm not going to find them and kill them. I'm not going to drive the van and run them down. You know what I mean? That rage I felt towards them was understandable, but the energy was wasted energy, And what I realized about I was 12 years sober when I forgave the men who abused me in Brazil at a healing place, a meditation place. And what I realized was that I needed to put all of my energy into my healing, into my journey. It sets me free. It doesn't set them free.
Yeah.
I mean, law of karma, whatever you choose to believe in, this is their shit. This is for me to heal. I realized that so much of the suffering was my reluctance, to accept what had happened in a sense of everything did happen, as opposed to denying it or running away from it or drinking on it or acting out in it or whatever. And then, as I said, the forgiveness is for me to be free. And those resentments against those men have never come back. It doesn't make it right. I mean, acceptance doesn't mean you like it. I don't like what happened. How could you? But, it has set me free to focus on my healing. So when I talk about the abuse now, and for a number of years now, I'm not suddenly wanting to go and hunt down these men and put a bullet in them like I used to. The times when I took the cricket bat out on me were the fantasies of getting it and killing them.
Right.
And I felt a justification in that as well. And the truth is, I've never been a violent man in my life.
Yeah.
And so had I acted out on that and been sent down to prison and all of that, I'm the one who's suffering again. And I don't judge anyone who does that, by the way, having known how much rage I felt for so long.
Yeah. I
don't judge anyone who's done it. I mean, God help them, But
so justice. I mean, I was quite interested this word of justice, and it's something that I learned as well. That only 10% don't know who their abusers are.
Yeah.
And
I'm in that category.
And you're in that 10%.
Yeah.
And I suppose this is where it comes into play even more, because I suppose if there's a trial and that they've got X amount of time, your healing has had to, I guess, come through a forgiveness route because you don't know who they are.
Do you know, justice isn't necessarily essential for healing. I've had no justice. When I wrote the book, I wrote it under a pseudonym because I wanted to put everything out there, but I wanted just to hold a little bit back for me, and I just held back my name, which now I use publicly. And also I felt a responsibility that, although my family had been aware of this, they haven't known the depth of it because I haven't volunteered it. And so I didn't want to shove everything out in the public arena under my own name for them to go through, obviously, a very traumatic experience themselves. It's been very difficult for them in many ways, But now it's out there, and I don't give a damn who knows about my story. I really don't.
Yeah.
That's the freedom I've got. I have no shame around it about what happened.
Absolutely.
As I said, it's all their shit. It's nothing to do with me.
And it's incredible the work you've been doing. I mean, I spoke about it in the intro, but you've been very public on many platforms, and I think it's so important for other people to heal, men and women.
It helps me though, Oliver. I know you do a lot of good work as well. It helps me. I mean, earlier on today, I was with another survivor who's in recovery, 18 months, doing incredibly well, and he's, bless him, at the stage now where a lot of the false beliefs about himself are there. So when we talk about about inventory and looking at our behavior, and we talk about, as I said, our behavior. And I asked him a little while ago, so tell me something really good about yourself. What do you like about yourself? And it's like,
couldn't do it.
And he couldn't do it because it brought up the shame. It brought up the rage. It brought up the anger, which he's still putting on himself, which I did for years, by the way. I do understand that. And so this is now hopefully serving as a catalyst for him to actually explore the fact that he is a very decent man, and he's kind, he's generous, he's an honest man, he's a great father, he's a great friend, he's helping other people, but he's struggling to release all this crap which came from the trauma, which is what a lot of us struggle with for some time, but it can be released.
Yeah. And you touched on it briefly about being in Brazil, because I know obviously AA's really helped you. Therapy, we've talked about that with the PTSD, and I think you did those things in tandem for a long time.
Yep.
I know a big part of your story is travel. Traveling is a big thing.
Yeah.
And spirituality as well.
Yeah.
Now, before we touch on that, because obviously not everyone, might not be in the position where they can travel, and I understand that. And there might be people listening to this that are atheist or agnostic, and they hear the word spirituality and they're like, be quiet. But I know it's a huge part of your story. What element of spirituality do you think it is that has been so healing?
That's a really good question. I've always been fascinated. I'm not a religious person at all, but I would say I'm a spiritual person in the sense that I believe there is a way we ought to live life, and I think it is part of our reason to be here, which is to be the best person we can be. And there's a lot of love and a lot of enjoyment that comes with that as well. So it's kind of a win-win. So I spend a lot of time in India. And I first went there in my early recovery, and it really opened my eyes, partly because it's the most extraordinary country. I mean, it's so different from the UK anyway. Yeah. But there I learned about meditation, and that helped me piece by piece, bit by bit, deal with this crazy head, which was in a complete mess. Yeah. And so I linked the psychologist's guidance around the grounding techniques, which just brought me out of here a little bit more into the present moment. And then I would ground myself over the course of maybe 20 minutes doing these various techniques. And then I would start to meditate, or mindfulness, which is kind of the more modern kind of word. None of that's got anything to do with God if you don't want it to have anything to do with God. It's a very practical thing, Yeah. So there are different labels used for different things, which might well describe exactly the same personal experience.
Because spirituality can mean a connecting to yourself and those around you. That is one of the definitions, isn't it?
I mean, I don't believe in an external God at all. I believe for me that there's a presence within all of us. Right. I think there's that deeper connection within you and within me and all of us, which is what we share, what we have in common. There is a presence. And the more I've let go of my own demons, so to speak, I don't mean that religiously for a minute. The more I let go of my trauma and my fears, and I still get fear, I still, I still get all those usual things. But the more I'm aware of an inner presence or a peacefulness within me, which is a very natural process. Now that happens for the atheist. It could happen for the born again.
Well, I think that's one of the things that really strikes me about you is that and you've just articulated it much better than I did earlier, that there is this kind of calm presence. I think that's what I meant. You all seem very in control of your feelings, very kind of in a very non-anxious state when I meet you. You seem not to sort of overly worry about outcomes and things that you're doing. And I'm always slightly jealous. I'm like, wow, how do you feel like
me on my best days, Oliver?
I must do. I must do. But despite all that we've talked about, that's your life now, and it has been for a very long time. And I find that really inspiring.
I had my moments, mate, of frustrations, believe me. Put me in front of a rugby match. Hey, I'm a Bath rugby fan. We're bottom. I'm not happy about that at all.
I don't know anything about rugby.
I know you're a football man. I appreciate that. But,
that's where you pick the ball up, isn't it? That's basketball. What's going on there?
But, I have my moments like the rest of us, and that's part of the human condition, if you like. But there are techniques which help us to ground ourselves. Yeah. And I think the challenge is that with PTSD or just with life, that it's easy for things to accumulate, which make it harder to get back to that place of that inner stillness. And so the more we can, I think, on a daily basis, try and live the best life we can by looking after ourselves with how we eat. I'm not brilliant at that, but I'm better than I used to be.
You're a good cook though, Andy, aren't you?
Yeah, I've got to learn a bit more about that. How we eat and how we rest and getting into nature. Nature is hugely important to me. I love being around nature. Yeah. I live within 15 minutes for Hampstead Heath. I'm up there usually twice a week, at least. When I was in the Himalayas in India, I trekked through the Himalayas a number of times, and it's just been extraordinary. And you find what works for you, and if it's having a dog, then great. If that brings you out of yourself, if that's a connection, I think one of the greatest gifts of AA for me personally, or any support group or friendship group of any kind is about that kind of loving connection with other people.
And I know you do a lot of work with fellow survivors, don't you? You're very connected with them.
I mean, I we talk about paying forward. The first guy I met in AA was this lovely old timer called Peter many, many years ago in Weston. And it turned out that he was also a survivor of child sexual abuse. And he was one of the people I was referring to earlier. He was that much further down the track of his healing journey than me. So I had someone to kind of just follow a little bit.
Right.
And I had some great women around me as well. So I've always had my own little support network of people.
Yeah.
So there are no secrets. There's an old saying, you're as sick as your secrets sort of thing. There are no secrets now. But I don't tell everyone everything, but I've got my own little cohort of key people who I love and I trust. And that's a hell of a statement for someone who's been sexually abused to say, who I can turn to, who are there for me. So I know I can't do this on my own. I think that's the main point.
Would that be one of your biggest bits of advice to someone listening to that who maybe hasn't told anyone about what they've been through, to find the strength to reach out to the right people and share their story and connect with others who have been through similar things? Yeah,
I had a chat about a week ago with another survivor, and bless him, he disclosed to me certain things he said he never shared with any other human being. And I was able to say to him, I said, what you've just described to me, I've heard hundreds of times now, and I've experienced that as well.
And that can be healing in itself, I assume.
The relief on his face was huge. The commonality we share as survivors of sexual abuse is massive.
Just quickly, Andy, I just want to get as much in as I can. I know that you do a lot of work, in an official way as well. You were part of a groundbreaking report and documentary, Numbing the Pain, produced by 1 in 4. I know that you continue your role as a consultant with the Centre of Expertise for CSA, and also that you work in conjunction with counsellors, therapists within this space. So it sounds like you're doing an awful lot in that space, public talks, working with Childline. I mean, so many things. What is it specifically that you're doing to help these people? Is it giving your exact experiences, or is there things that need to change perhaps within the framework of what's available?
I think there's a couple of things to say. One was there are friends of mine who are survivors who have read my book, who every now and then will say to me that, one said to me a little while ago that I was sitting down with my wife and I was trying to verbalize what I was going through. And he said the easiest way I could do it was to go to your book and said, please read that paragraph. That's what's going on for me.
Yeah.
So that kind of shared experience, shared lived experience, I think is really important, that no one is on their own. They're not alone. People do understand there is a way through this. We really can heal.
Yeah.
It takes time. It does. And it takes the support of good trauma therapists who are experienced with PTSD. I think that's really important. And that's not to put down any counsellors or anyone else, but I think it's a very specific need for trauma kind of therapy. And the role working with Sarah, my trauma therapist, as I do, is to give my lived experience. So I go into a lot more depth about what happened, about the grooming and the way it affected my mind, and about the suppressed memories and the fragmented memories and how they've coalesced into. It's rather like a jigsaw, pieces being thrown at you, and you're trying to make sense of it. And with all of those pieces comes the most awful, overwhelming, crippling emotion of self-hatred and that sense that you're about to die, And over a period of time, those memories or fragments have come together. And it's trying to help counsellors and therapists who have vastly experienced, a lot of them, just hear that from a survivor's point of view. And there's myself and another dear friend, JJ, bless him, who's a survivor. And he's public about that, so I can say his name. And a lady as well, and we do this fairly regularly, and we've just come together, and it's just a great bond and a privilege between us, because we know exactly what the other has been through.
Yeah.
And at the beat, very quickly, I remember doing a talk about this stuff in Dundee about 5 years ago, and I'm in the hotel the night before, Oliver, and I just want to fucking run. I'm so scared, and it's the first public talk I'd done to a group of people outside of AA, because although I hadn't gone into detail in AA, I'd refer to it in AA, as you can do. And But this was a group of therapists and counsellors and the police and the judiciary and the CPS and so forth.
Wow.
And it was terrifying. And afterwards I was dissociated and I was like, and then I think, well, how am I now? The difference in those 5 years is huge. I don't relive it now. I've talked about it in some detail. I could have gone more graphic. I don't want to trigger people. But I'm present and I'm here and I don't feel any shame. That's the healing. And I never, ever thought that would happen. There were so many times in my life and I just thought, oh, for fuck's sake, when the fuck is this ever going to... Because I'd be reliving another experience of it. Another memory would come back. I think, oh, God's sake. And I'd just be, just be so angry and confused. And that hasn't happened. I haven't had the visual flashbacks for 5 years now. I can get emotional flashbacks, but they don't cripple me. It's not like that gut-wrenching kind of like it used to be.
I mean, that is astounding and such testament to you as a survivor of just never giving up and always making strides to heal and find a solution. You really are such an inspiration, Andy. Anyone who's been listening to this for the last hour, I hope you feel as privileged as I do being here live. I know when I spoke to you a couple of days ago in preparation for this podcast, and I said, have you got any links that you want to share? And you directed me to your website, and I couldn't believe how many resources were there. I really encourage anybody listening or watching this to go to your website, which is www.mattcareybooks.com. I'll say that again, www.mattcareybooks.com. You'll find information there about how to get Andy's book, of course, but also there's a brilliant link under people who can help. And I was astounded by the resources there and how much help there is available on there. And I think rather than give all the links, just go there because, you've obviously spent a lot of time making sure that everything is there where it should be. Unfortunately, we're out of time. And like I've said before on this podcast, I wish we had longer, but Andy, thank you so much for coming on today.
It's been a great privilege. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Really appreciate it. And I'll see you on the next one in 2 weeks. Thanks for watching and listening. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.